Hello and welcome to today's session. We're going to talk about the introduction to threats, attacks, and vulnerabilities. Let's get started. So we're going to talk high level. We're going to break this apart into two sections. First section is going to talk about some terminology around vulnerabilities, threats, and attacks. We'll talk about what a threat actor types are. We'll talk about some attack vectors, and then threat intelligence sources. Of course, we'll get into different types of attacks. We'll break them down further into advanced attacks, social engineering attacks, malware and virus attacks. We'll talk about some different types of vulnerabilities. We'll get into ethical hacking tools and a little bit of network scanning. Let's get started. So, introduction to vulnerabilities, threats, and attacks. All right, so we'll talk about the differences between vulnerabilities and threats. And you can think of vulnerabilities as being the gaps or weaknesses that undermine some companies' IT security efforts, right? So let's say we didn't configure our firewall right, so we're vulnerable to maybe some network attacks, right? Delays in applying operating system patches. We haven't applied our Windows updates, haven't ran in maybe 6 months, right? That creates a vulnerability. And so the software tools that you'd be able to use to determine some of these vulnerabilities, you run some scans and determine here are all kinds of vulnerabilities that we have. Now, a threat is what we're going to be defending ourselves against, right? Some type of attack. So a DOS, denial of service attack, um, could be taking advantage of some vulnerabilities that we have, right? So you want to think of vulnerabilities are weaknesses or flaws, and threats are the dangers that are posed by others to our system. All right. So you get a little bit of a definition of a vulnerability. It's a weakness that can be triggered accidentally or exploited intentionally, right, to cause a security breach. Whereas a threat is the potential for someone or something to exploit a vulnerability and in turn breach security. Now, an attack is a threat that's being carried out. A threat is, you know, somebody can carry out a denial of service attack because we have some vulnerability, right? An attack is when somebody actually carries out that threat. The denial of service attack actually happens. It's thought of as an attack. An attack could be passive or active, um, and it can be carried out by somebody inside of the organization or maybe an external hacker, right? Threat actors or agents, you want to pay attention to that definition there, is the person or thing that poses the threat. So the person that's likely to attack us, right, is known as a threat actor, a type of person that can, carry out that threat. A threat or attack vector, and those words are used interchangeably sometimes, threat vector versus attack vector, is a technique or tool that could be used by a malicious threat actor. So a threat actor could be a script kiddie, for example, right? A type of hacker, right? Script kiddie. And they might use some different tools to carry out some of these malicious um, attacks. And so those tools that they might use is what we call a vector, tools or techniques that they might use. And we'll get into all of those a little bit deeper. We just want you to have a good overview of what some of these terminologies mean. So if you see them, you can identify those. So what's the risk? And we're going to get into risk management. We'll go a little bit deeper into risk management, big part of security, risk assurance, all that good stuff. In fact, that's a whole course on just risks. But there is a connection between vulnerabilities and threats and assets with risk. So risk is the likelihood and impact or consequence of a threat actor exploiting a vulnerability. So the organization might have some assets, assets being maybe we've got a couple servers, we've got a building, those are things that the organization owns, so assets. Um, and we might try to protect those assets as security professionals. Our goal is to protect the assets of the organization. Now, the risk is going to be the likelihood that that asset could be compromised, and the impact, meaning that if it was compromised, what are we going to lose? Are we losing $10,000 or are we losing $500? Right? What's the impact? What's the reach um, of that vulnerability being exploited? So that's what risk is. You can look at a very nice formula that says vulnerability times threat equals risk. And what is vulnerability? The value of the asset and the ease of an exploit, right? So how easy it is to exploit it versus the value will give you some level of magnitude of the vulnerability. Then threat would be, is it being, what threat vector is being used, what tools are being used, what type of actor is doing this, right? Is this some type of hacktivist? Is it script kiddie? Is it malicious or accidental hack? Is it by an internal employee or an external vendor of some sort or hacker? And then you want to think about the likelihood, which is the probability that it would happen. Is it high, low, medium? And then the impact. Is it going to be a large impact? We're going to risk a lot of money or that type of thing. So that's how you want to be thinking of the relationship between vulnerabilities, threats, and risks. Now, here are some examples. So assuming we have a vulnerability of a terminated employee still having access to our VPN credentials because somebody forgot to disable it, the threat is that that person would be able to log into the company network, right, and access proprietary information remotely. The risk is unauthorized disclosure of sensitive business information. The risk there is somebody who shouldn't be able to get into the network, right, will be able to get sensitive business information after they've been terminated, right? They've been fired, or perhaps they left the company um, and they still have access, right? So those are some ways in which you want to think about the differences between vulnerabilities, threats, and risk. Another one is, um, you know, we're not maintaining the firefighting equipment in the data center, so maybe fire hydrant type stuff. The threat is that if there is fire, we would lose lives or data or the infrastructure in the organization. So the risk is what's the probability and the impact of that thing happening. The threat itself is that, if you don't maintain the fire fighting equipment and a fire, which is a threat, surfaces, there's some consequence. So consequence is the risk. The problem that we're trying to guard against is the threat. And the vulnerability is some weakness that we have that would make the threat possible. All right. Now, here's a nice capture of some security threats across organizations. You would notice a large percentage of these happen to be external threats, which would be kind of hackers trying to break in. But right behind that would be internal threats, which would be more like insiders. And we'll talk about some stories about how folks do that. Another big one would be phishing and hacking and malware attacks. So we'll talk about different attacks that are related to that, and you'll see how that breaks down. So let's get into what a threat actor is and intelligence sources, right? So how do we know that there's a new virus out there, right? What's the best practice for staying on top of this as a security professional? What are some sources that we would need to pay attention to? All right, let's get into it. So the objective here is that a security professional, your goal is defending assets, as we talked about, right? So you might need to be able to explain what are the different tactics and techniques and procedures for threat attackers. Now, I'll tell you to make a note of those three words: tactics, techniques, and procedures. The acronym that's typically used for that is TTP, right? If you see TTP on your Security Plus exam or your midterm exam or something like that, then you probably know what that means. It's a very common phrase to describe tactics, techniques, and procedures that threat actors, or you can think of threat actors as some type of hackers, would use. So we need to know what those techniques, tactics, and procedures are. We might need to be able to differentiate between the various types and capabilities of threat actors. What are the different types of threats that are out there, and what's possible. We need to also be able to explain some reliable sources for threat intelligence. How do we know the latest viruses that are out there, or the latest exploits and things like that? All right, so let's talk about that. The different uh, threat actors, right, out there are categorized using four main attributes, and you need to know this for your Security Plus certification if that's something of interest. So the four main categories would be: is it an internal or external threat actor? Meaning, is it an internal um, criminal, or is it an external criminal doing it, right? So internal folks would be known as insiders, and they carry out some of the most dangerous threats from your own environment. Generally, we like to think of threat actors as being external hackers. They could be your competitors, it could be just criminals, or just people who are curious. A young little kid wants to know something, and he's got access to some tools for doing this type of thing. And sometimes these things might happen accidentally. Now, level of sophistication and capability is of interest because it depends on level of what type of threat actor might range from a script kiddie who would be, somebody like you and I who are maybe new to ethical hacking. We find some sample code or programs that can be used to build viruses. We're playing with it, unleash some of that stuff, and you exploit some vulnerability. That's maybe the you know bottom of the spectrum. The high end of the spectrum would be advanced persistent threat, APT. You want to make a note of APT. Advanced persistent threat actors would be folks who have well established research labs, um, and they're trying to exploit all kinds of vulnerabilities. They would typically come up with 0-day attacks, and we'll get into what is a 0-day attack. But they'll come up with potentially viruses and exploits that are unknown to the security community because they're practically inventing and testing some of these things, right? Resources and funding, right? It could range from, a hobbyist, a part-time hacker who has limited resources. They're probably using free tools and that type of thing, to well-organized and sponsored criminal syndicates, and sometimes even folks that are backed by national governments. And folks that are backed by national governments might have virtually limitless resources. So the U.S. government might have some type of support for getting access to information, maybe from a different government. It's just an example. And so the folks that are hired to do that type of thing might have lots and lots of resources, being money, funding, and that type of thing to support their work, right? They needed stuff for their research, so on and so forth. Now, intent and motivation is another way of categorizing threat actors. So they, script kiddies might be doing it just out of the thrill of attacking somebody or initiating themselves, becoming the, getting through the first attack, right? To folks that are maybe doing it to, prove something politically or do some type of economic justification of something, so on and so forth. So let's talk about the six major threat actors. What are the main categories of actors? Previously, we were talking about how would we categorize them, right? There are four ways. These are the main categories of or types of threat actors, if you will. So they're insiders who could be employees, contractors, and vendors. Then you're talking about competitors who might be, staging some type of attack potentially to steal sensitive information so they can gain some type of business advantage. Script kiddies, that's more of a derogatory term for folks that have limited skills in hacking. They're new to hacking. Maybe they're using free tools online to build a Trojan horse or ransomware, that type of thing. And you're going to see a large group of folks that fall in that category, right? Typically acting as an individual. Then you get into a little bit more sophistication with hacktivists. They would use hacking techniques to do some type of activism. They might deface a website for political reasons or for the fact that they don't agree with the policies that they have. A very uh, common group that you would see as a hacktivist is the anonymous group, and they've attacked several targets: Mastercard, Visa, PayPal, the Church of Scientology. You could also think of Edward Snowden as perhaps a hacktivist, and I believe this one might be in your quiz. It's a multiple answer question, uh, and you could read about Ed Snowden if you don't know who he is. Criminal syndicates would be another group of threat actors. This would be, folks that are part of the Russian mafia, for example, right? Well organized crime groups or families or gangs that might carry out some type of attack, maybe from a terrorism perspective or some dark web activity, so on and so forth. And the most advanced version of this or threat actor would be the advanced persistent threats, the APTs. These are generally backed by some type of state or government or corporation, right? So it could be nation state actors. You might see, that's why that's highlighted in your exam on the Security Plus. You might see this referred to sometimes as nation state actors. Um, they would be some form of APT. Almost every advanced country has some type of APT, and a very good example would be the Chinese military. Um, APTs generally conduct their own research, as we mentioned, and so their exploits or attacks that they come up with would be considered zero-day attacks, meaning that nobody knows of the virus that they just created or Trojan horse that they just invented. So your regular antivirus software would not likely have that um, fix yet, right? Till it gets the next update, till we discover that, oh, this is an exploit and let's build a solution for it. This is how to detect it, this is how to clean it up, that type of thing, right? Those types of attacks where they come in fresh are known as the zero-day attack. So APTs, they generally drive zero-day attacks. Um, so there's no security patch or virus solution to usually correct those. And sometimes they're referred to as a Stuxnet attack. So what are some threat vectors? What are some tools that I used and techniques that I used um, to carry out threats? Attackers may attempt to gain initial access to an organization through uh, direct physical access, as in dumpster diving. We'll talk about what dumpster diving is. So you don't shred your sensitive PII data and you put it in the trash. There are a whole set of folks that prey on that type of thing. They look through your trash and find bank account information, so on and so forth, that could be used for identity theft and so on and so forth. Those could be through physical access, right? So physical access to your trash can at your office or at your house, right? So dumpster diving is a type of attack that takes advantage of that. Um, you know, Dumpster diving could also involve somebody looking through the recycle bin on your computer, because when you delete files, it typically goes into a recycle bin, and then you have to empty out the recycle bin. Well, most people forget to empty out the recycle bin, so you might have deleted sensitive data, which is just like putting, your bank information in the trash, right, without shredding it. So same concept applies to your computer. If you're deleting files that are sensitive, make sure you empty the recycle bin. Same concept for your email. When you delete your email, it just goes in the trash. Most people forget to clear out the trash. If there's sensitive data in there and somebody gets access to your email, they might be looking through the trash or the recycle bin. It's another form of dumpster diving, except that one doesn't require physical access, right? But we're talking physical access in this example. You could use email for phishing attacks, right? Send you an email that says, hey, click this link, blah, blah, blah. And then we collect some sensitive information from you, or get you to click a link that downloads a virus or a keylogger, or so on and so forth. Social media could be used to elicit information, which is part of what we were doing in the first lab exercise for recognizant or footprinting. Wireless network connection. We'll talk about different types of attacks for wireless networks, but war driving is one of those, where you're detecting Wi-Fi, access points that are wide open or that you can crack and get into the network and collect a lot of information just by sitting outside of your house or driving by your neighborhood and parking somewhere close to your home Wi-Fi, so I can get some information. Or it could be at a hotel, you connect to the Wi-Fi, or you're at the airport using shared Wi-Fi. So we'll talk about some of those concepts and attacks. Removable media, which would be like a USB drive that can be plugged in, is a very common way to infect machines with keyloggers. So if you come back to your computer and there's some USB drive plugged in, a foreign USB drive that you don't recognize, more than likely you need to be worried about things like keyloggers, other types of malicious software that could be uh, used to infect your machine through USB drives or other removable media. Cloud services, DOS, denial of service attacks against cloud vendors, or distributed denial of service, I should say, is probably maybe more relevant for cloud solutions that might have infinite capacity. Another one would be third-party risk or supply chain. So you you know you compromise a supplier or contractor, and all the folks that use that third party or supplier or contractor, could also be affected. Now we get into what are the different intelligence sources, right? So security professionals um, need to be able to have access to um, current threats and vulnerabilities, right? As a security professional, what you know as a threat today is different from what the threats and vulnerabilities are going to be tomorrow. So how do you stay on top of that so you're always ready to protect these guys, especially for things like zero-day attacks and that type of thing. You can't just wait till there's a patch ready, right? You need to constantly research and stay on top of these things. So how do we go about getting that type of intelligence, right? Think of the U.S. intelligence agencies, right? Your company is probably going to be looking to you as the intelligence security professional. So you need to find a way to stay on top of it. So how do we do that? There are a number of intelligence sources, security intelligence sources. OSINT, Open Source Intelligence, which is a low-cost, high-reward approach that you can look into. You can do a search on OSINT to learn a little bit more about it. For the sake of what we need to do in preparation for the Security Plus, we just need to know that these are the options. I don't go too deep into each one of these, but you could dive into it and get to learn a little bit more about OSINT. We just need to be able to identify intelligence sources. There could be closed and proprietary databases that you pay some funds to be able to get this type of access to. They curate and aggregate and sell this intelligence information. So Recorded Future is one of those. Triton is another one. The NIST has a National Vulnerability Database, NVD, that you could subscribe to as well. There are also public and private information sharing centers. The most popular would be ISACS and ISAO. They share intelligence and best practices across geographical and industry segments. So industry segments might be, maybe manufacturing or retail and that type of thing. Dark web, also sometimes referred to as dark net, could be a good resource. So generally, if you're not in the security world, you might not be spending time on the dark web unless you're doing something naughty. But as a security professional, there would be times when you'd find yourself looking things up in the dark web. You gotta know how the hackers are thinking to be better equipped to counteract their potential actions, right? So the how-to guides, the corporate data being sold on there. Maybe you want to figure out if your organization's data has been being sold or transacted out there. Sometimes you get to learn about upcoming attacks that are being planned through the dark web. Other intelligence sources, AIS, automated indicator sharing, threat maps. FireEye is one that I've used in the past, so I put the link out there. Provides a live, kind of real-time graphical display of a set of cyber attacks that are occurring, at any given point in time. You can see a map of all the cyber attacks that are currently happening, which is a cool thing to see, but also gives you some sense of what's happening and the threats that are out there. Code repositories. So Visual Studio Online or Azure DevOps, they call it these days, and GitHub are all code repositories or source code repositories that offer the ability to study open source software to figure out if there are vulnerabilities in them. So if your company is using an open source software, more than likely that open source software has its code publicly accessible on GitHub, which is the most popular source code repository these days, right? Which means you could study what the actual code, C#, Java code does, and poke around and figure out if there are gaps in it. You could do some analysis on those, right? So that could be a source of intelligence of what some potential gaps would be or weaknesses in the program is. You could use predictive analysis, using data sources and machine learning to predict events um, or potential attacks and hacking before it actually happens. Now, how do we share information regarding intelligence? There's threat indicator management and exchange. How do we share this type of information? There's a structured markup language known as STIX. The current version is STIX 2.0. It was invented by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. STIX is short for Structured Threat Information Expression. The idea was to standardize a way for threat information to be processed and used in automated ways. So you could share information using this, and um, so there was an XML version of it. Now there's a JSON format. JSON is JavaScript um, notation. So nice structure. I'll show you an example of what the JSON sticks document might look like. We need to know about sticks for the exam and for general knowledge, because you're going to see this in a more enterprise security environment. TAXII taxi protocol goes along with sticks, so we need to be aware of that. It happens to be on your quiz as well, so keep that in mind. That's the protocol that you would use for threat indicator management or exchange or sharing. There's another format, structured markup language called OpenIOC, Open Indicators of Compromise format as well. Stix is by far the most popular solution, Stix 2.0. So what is Stix used for? It's a structure, structured document that could tell us what activity are we seeing, so you can share that type of information. What threats should I look for on my network and systems, and people can share that type of thing. Where has this threat been seen? What does it do? What weaknesses does this threat exploit? Right? Why does it do this? Who is responsible for this threat? What can I do about it? Right? So if somebody comes up with a threat and they post it somewhere or publish it, and we have an automated way of consuming that in real time, this is the type of information that would come from the STIX document that's shared between organizations or different data sources. So this is an example of what the JSON document for STIX 2.0 would look like. Indicator types, malware, the description file used by malware X, what date was it created on, so on and so forth. All right, so here are some research sources. If you are a security professional, you're going to want to stay on top of all kinds of new findings regarding security. Most of your time will be spent reading and researching what's hot, what you need to stay on top of from a security perspective. So here are some good sources. And if you were pursuing the Security Plus, you would need to know some of these as they would be on the exam. So these are research sources, some of them being intelligence sources as well. So vendor security websites, that category. Microsoft, for example, has a Microsoft Security Intelligence blog. Different vendors might have their own intelligence blogs that you want to stay on top of. There are different vulnerability feeds. So the US NVD, National Vulnerability Database, would be an example of that. There are different professional conferences that you'd want to be involved with if you're interested in staying in the security community. DEF CON, Black Hat, B-Sides, those are all examples. There are different academic journals that publish the latest and greatest research around cybersecurity. There's RFCs, or requests for comments. IETF produces some of those. Local industry groups that you could probably get involved with, InfraGard, so on and so forth. Uh, Through social media, you can follow some of the, top 25 prominent security professionals, and they would have all kinds of updates that you could use to follow what's going on. You could consume threat feeds. Those Some of those could be RSS feeds from AT&T Cybersecurity, FireEye, SecureWorks. Those are all kind of online social media or threat feeds data that you could consume to do research. Adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures. I talked about TTPs. SANS Internet Storm Center provides some data on, hey, here are some tactics, techniques, and procedures um, for the security community. So you can use some of these categories of research sources to stay on top of what's happening. To summarize, we talked about the basic definitions of a vulnerability, a threat, an attack, and a risk, right? Vulnerability is the weakness. The threat is the exploitation of the vulnerability. An attack is when you actually carry out the threat, and a risk is a function of vulnerability and threat. So we say vulnerability times threat gives us risk, and then we talked about um, the likelihood of some attack um, being a function of a risk, from a security perspective. We also talked about impact. So likelihood and impact being two of the key attributes for determining risk. And there's actually a calculation for risk. We'll get into that later on. We talked about some of the different types of threats. We talked about what a threat actor is. That is the type of person that could do that. Hacktivists, APTs, script kiddies, that type of thing. Then we talked about ways to categorize those. There were 4 categories. We talked about the 6 different threat actors. We talked about threat vectors, which are what are some techniques and tools that I used for this type of thing. Then we talked about threat intelligence and research sources as something that we would need to stay on top of what's going on from a security perspective. So that concludes our lecture for today. We'll be talking about a lot more on threats, vulnerabilities, and attacks soon. Bye bye.